What up, friends? I burned my finger and it hurts. But today we're going to be reviewing Rag & Bone Man's newest album, Life by Misadventure. London-based singer-songwriter Rag & Bone Man, also known as Rory Graham, has finally released his newest album 4 years after his debut back in 2017. With a booming voice, soulful instrumentals, and down-to-earth songwriting, he became kind of a sleeper hit with his debut album. It wasn't exactly loved by most critics, but in spite of the sort of mainstream The Voice X Factor take on the Blue Eyes Soul sound, I thought his first record was overall pretty solid. It was safe, yeah, but it did a great job in showcasing his vocal talents. It had a pretty great amount of variety on it, and I think it was a really good starting platform to kind of take off from and experiment with. Unfortunately, he did not take up that opportunity. Life by Misadventure is almost a completely different shift in sound, focusing more on acoustic guitar, ballads, and just kind of adult contemporary nonsense. Almost everything that he displayed on his debut album has been completely thrown out the window in favor for a sound that is very basic, less interesting, and has little to no variety to speak of. However, I will say that Fireflies, the first track on the album, is a pretty good first impression. I like the background vocals alongside the very raw and natural cadence to Rory's main vocals. The acoustic guitar, simple beat, and warm aesthetic have pretty nice vibes when paired with the very natural imagery in the lyrics. It's simple yet dynamic at the same time, which is something that I feel a lot of the tracks on this album lack, unfortunately. The hopeful nature of lines like, "keep your eyes on the lights and let everyone know that you caught it," like fireflies in the garden, are well done and really fit the mood of the track overall. Unfortunately, after this track is when the problem hits. You start to realize that as more and more songs go by, the album largely does not deviate from this sound at all. It rarely strays from the path. What could have been a really pleasant one-off turns into a slog of monotony. Almost every track in the first half of the record has this very acoustic and piano-driven ballad effect to it that is just utterly boring. There are some attempts to shake things up, like with the more pop-driven beats on Fall in Love Again, alongside teaming up with Pink to have this sort of adult contemporary sound, but all of this just falls horribly flat. Even these elements barely switch things up at all, and when they do, they feel pandering and unnatural. In fact, I think the biggest sin of this album is this meandering sense of nothingness. There's little to no variety in the instrumentals of any of the tracks on the first half, and with Rory largely singing in pretty similar ways on each song, it just doesn't really hold my attention or show that any of the track has any identity of its own or wants to do anything interesting. It comes off something like Leonard Cohen, but without the wit and the blunt and poetic songwriting. Now, admittedly, I am much more of an instrumental guy, so this might be why the album isn't really resonating with me, because if I don't have an instrumental to keep me engaged, I largely won't really delve into whatever the track's message is. I will say that the second half of the record does get a bit better though, starting with All You Ever Wanted. The fuzzy guitar, bass, and a much-needed jolt of energy are pretty refreshing to hear. It kind of reminds me of some of his stuff that he did pre-debut, actually. It has this sort of bluesy, indie rock feel that is ultimately pretty engaging. His vocals may not be belting as much here, but he does mesh them well with the instrumental, and it's nice to see him doing something different. It is a bit lyrically cliche and vague, but it does work well enough for what the track's going for. Changing of the Guard, on the other hand, is a bit more similar to his debut album. It has a low-key groove with the bass and background vocals that combine really well with his soulful tones, and the addition of the little synths that appear here and there are a pretty welcome addition. It's also probably one of the tracks with the most identity on this album as well. I also think the lyrical angle is pretty interesting, with him sort of ruminating on the fact that he's going to become a father, now is a father, and he kind of has to change his life up a little bit. It's sort of the death of his old life and the birth of something new, which is pretty cool. Time Will Only Tell is another pretty cool track, going for a more bluesy direction this time. It kind of brings back some of Rory's roots in a certain way. It has a soulful jam band aesthetic to it, combining a sort of complexity with a sense of rawness as well, and I feel like Rory is pretty good at this overall. The structure of the track is pretty familiar, however, it places a lot of emphasis on the bridge, which I thought was interesting, and it has this sort of suave and intimate feel to it. These instrumentals suit this sort of lament over the fact that we have to actually, stand up and fight against bigotry, stand up for your fellow human beings, and sort of embrace all of this change that's occurring. In a way, it's sort of a cry to stop being just a bystander, I guess. The last track I want to talk about is Party's Over. It's not the ending song, but it does have a good sense of finality to it. I'm really digging the dark combo of the piano, guitar, and the drums on this one. The background vocals are dramatic and elegant, and the build-up in the pre-chorus has a pretty nice culmination in the chorus itself. It's very climactic and well done. This track is probably my favorite on the entire project, actually. It has an urgent nature to it, like the change that you need to make needs to be done now. This is pretty accurate to the lyrics, as Rory is explaining a story about his friend who basically had the stick together for the kids mindset when it came to his relationship, when it ended up actually just making everything worse. It's a really good song about letting go, and I just wish we had the dynamics of this track and its instrumental on everything else on the project. At the end of the day, the biggest crime that this album commits is just being utterly boring and forgettable. Very few solid tracks have an identity of their own in the grand scheme of things, and they barely stand out from each other, especially in the first half of the project. There are moments on the album that kind of rekindle the energy and bring back things that he's experimented with before, but it's just not enough. I don't want a repeat of the last album by any means, however, this album does not show growth to me. It shows regression into easy listening that I just don't really care about, and it just doesn't really make me feel anything. Overall, I'm feeling a strong 3 on this, maybe light 4 if I'm feeling generous, but I'm going to be revisiting like 5 tracks on this thing, but there's 14 in total. Like, that's not great. Of course, we do have to talk about album covers on the show, and, for what it's worth, this is a pretty good album cover. I like how it's sort of very dark and somber in its imagery, with him with his eyes shut, very calm expression. As far as color scheme goes, I love how everything is pretty much like a black or a dark shade of blue until you get to the warmness of his face. I think it has that sort of good contemplative nature to it. The tear in the middle kind of shows a life change, like he's heading towards a new life after the death of his old one, like when he became a father. So the album cover was good. I just wish the music was more impactful to go along with it. But of course, those are just my thoughts on the new Rag & Bone Man project. What did you guys think? Do you think this is actually an improvement on his previous work? Or is the lack of variety really killing it for you? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Ring the bell if you want to hear more from me. And until the next one, farewell.